We all admire the great attacking players of the past when we see their brilliant combinations and sacrifices. But the question is, what's the secret of their attacks? And can we also learn to sacrifice pieces correctly? In order to do it, it's necessary to get an insight into the nature of a sacrifice and attacking principles. In other words, we must understand how to prepare the ground for a sacrifice. And the following game, which earned Efim Geller a brilliancy prize, might help us in this matter. In this game, Geller sacrifices a lot of material, and you will get a chance to follow the attacking principles that made these fantastic sacrifices possible. Geller's opponent starts with e4. Geller plays the Sicilian defense, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and Geller plays the Najdorf variation, a6, taking under control the b5 square, preventing the white pieces from moving there, and preparing the queenside expansion by playing b5 later in the game. White opts for the variation with h3. He prepares his own expansion on the king side by playing g4 next move. Geller develops his knight, white plays g4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4. In this position, the conventional move for black would have been e6. Black would take under control the important central d5 square, but his position would be cramped. Instead of e6 in our game, Geller plays e5, which at first sight might look anti-positional, because by playing e5, black has permanently weakened the d5 square, and this square might become a great outpost for the white pieces, especially for the knight. Besides that, after e5, the d6 pawn has become eternally backward, and the white major pieces will exert pressure on this pawn on the half-open d-file. On the other hand, by playing e5, Geller takes under control the important squares on white's territory, the d4 and the f4 squares. Besides that, he vacates the e6 square for his bishop, so his position after e5 will definitely be less cramped than with the pawn on e6. And this compensates for the weakness of the d5 square and the d6 pawn. Besides that, the e5 advance came with a tempo. The white queen is under attack, so the queen retreats to d3. Bishop e7 followed, bishop g2, bishop e6. In this position, it would be better for white either to continue the pawn storm on the king side by playing g5. In this case, after possible knight d7, h4 and knight c5, the position would be extremely sharp. Or white could have thought about his king's safety, as in the center the king isn't safe enough. So white could have either castled kingside, but it seems that white didn't feel like castling kingside, and it's understandable, as his kingside is already weakened, as his h and g pawns have moved, and white is going to push these pawns even further in order to create threats to the black king, as the king is going to castle kingside. But white could also castle queenside by playing bishop e3 followed by long castle. But instead of all these options, white plays b3. He still wants to castle queenside, but instead of developing the bishop on e3, he's going to fianchetto the bishop and only then castle queenside. And from b2, the bishop will exert pressure on black's center, and white is going to increase the pressure by playing f4, attacking the e5 pawn for the second time. So the bishop will play an attacking role and also a defensive role. It will defend the king after it castles queenside. So at first sight, this plan makes perfect sense. However, actually it has a serious drawback, and you will see what this drawback is very soon. Geller castles kingside, bishop b2, and he starts his expansion on the queenside, b5, and white castles queenside. So we have reached a position with the opposite side castles. White castled queenside, black castled kingside. And in these kind of positions, the most important thing is whose pawn storm is going to be faster, who is going to open files first in order to create threats to the enemy king. And in order to answer this question, we should pay attention to the pawn structure. The black pawns on the king side are still on their initial squares, and that means it will take white a lot of time in order to push his pawns forward and open files in order to create threats to the black king, while the white pawn on the queen side, is already on b3. And that was the main drawback of the plan with bishop b2 and long castle. It will take black just 2 moves to push his pawn from a6 to a4 and then open the a file for his major pieces. So black's attack is going to be faster, and that means black's chances in this position are better. And Geller is the first to cross the center of the board, b4, with a tempo, attacking the knight. In case white plays knight d5, which is the most natural move, Geller prepared the exchange on d5. Bishop takes d5, and this exchange would be in black's favor, as white would love to capture the bishop with the queen in order to keep the d file half open and keep the pressure on the backward d6 pawn. But he cannot do it, as the bishop is defended by the knight. So he would be forced to capture with a pawn, and his own pawn on d5 would close the d file for the major pieces, and the d6 pawn would stop being weak in this case. That's why instead of natural knight d5, white played knight e2. But the knight is passively placed on e2, and now we can see the power of the e5 pawn. This pawn completely restricts the knight, and it also closes the bishop's diagonal. And Geller continues his pawn storm, a5. White plays f4, creating an immediate threat to capture twice on e5 and win a pawn. Of course, in order to prevent this threat, black cannot capture on f4. That would be a mistake, because that would open the bishop's diagonal and would activate the white knight. Of course, Geller didn't do it. Instead, he defends his pawn by playing knight d7. And also, he reroutes his knight from the king side to the queen side. Now white crosses the center of the board with a tempo, attacking the bishop. It might seem that the bishop is trapped, as it cannot retreat because the knight is closing its diagonal, but of course it isn't the case, because black can play knight c5 with a tempo, attacking the queen, and now the black knight is greatly placed. And it will play a very important role in the attack on the white king, as you will see. And white must save his queen, so queen f3. And we have reached the critical position. Now you can pause the video and try to find Geller's idea, what to do. His bishop is under attack. So we have reached the first important attacking principle applied by Geller in this game, which is the dynamic energy. The attacking side should always try to increase the dynamic energy of his position. But in case the bishop, which is under attack, retreats, the energy of black's position would decrease, and that would let white continue his pawn storm by playing h4, which would be quite unpleasant. White would threaten to play g5 next move, followed by f6 with a tempo, attacking the bishop, open the files on the king side, destroying black's pawn structure on the king side, and create threats to the black king. And in case black, after white plays h4, accepts the sacrifice and captures on h4, then that of course would open the h file, and again white might get some counter chances, so he can exert strong pressure on the h file by playing queen h3 next move, for example, attacking the bishop for the second time. And after it retreats, the h7 pawn might fall under attack. So if the bishop retreats, then black would lose the dynamic energy of his position. But what else can black do except retreating the bishop? The bishop is under attack. Geller took into consideration another attacking principle: open files. The attacking side should always try to open files, and especially in the position with opposite side castles, it's essential to open files as soon as possible. So Geller keeps his bishop on e6, retaining the energy of his position, and even increases it by opening the a file for his major pieces. He plays a4, sacrificing the bishop. And it turns out that in case white immediately captures the bishop, accepting the sacrifice, after f takes e, the f file would open with a tempo, the white queen would be under attack, the black rook would become very strong, and it turns out that the queen doesn't have any good squares to move. c3 and d3 of course are controlled by black. The queen, which is very important, cannot move to e3 either, because after bishop g5 it would be pinned and lost. So the queen would be forced to move to g3. But in this case, Geller prepared bishop h4, attacking the queen and forcing it to move to h2. And in this position, white would be up a piece, but his queen, his rook and his bad bishop, which is restricted by its own pawn, would be completely out of play, while the black pieces would be very strong. The rook and the knight are already greatly placed. Geller would have opened the a file with the tempo for his second rook. Now the second rook is also very strong. Then the bishop, which has already completed its mission on h4 by kicking out the queen, would be brought into attack with great effect. Check. And after king b1, the last piece, the strongest one, the queen, would be brought into attack, and all black pieces would take part in the attack, and black would threaten checkmate in 1. And there is nothing white can do. He can try knight c1, taking under control the a2 square, but it doesn't help because of the next attacking principle, the removal of key defenders. And the key defenders of the white king are the knight and the bishop. So first black would have removed the knight. Of course, white cannot capture the bishop with his bishop or the rook because of checkmate in 1. He would be forced to capture the bishop with the king, but now another beautiful sacrifice would follow. Knight takes b3 check in order to open the c file, and after c takes b, queen c5 check. If the king moves to d2, then rook f2 check would lead to checkmate in a few moves. And in case the king moves to b1 instead, then still rook f2, black is threatening checkmate in 1. To prevent it, white can play rook c1, but now again the removal of the key defender, this time the bishop. And so rook takes b2 check. And you should also pay attention to the role of the pawn in the attack. So this pawn is very strong and it can be counted as a piece. And after king takes b2, queen f2 check, rook c2, queen d4 check, again would lead to checkmate. That's why after a4, white didn't accept the sacrifice of the bishop right away. Instead, he played h4. White continues his pawn storm on the king side and takes under control the g5 square, which is very important. Now white can capture the bishop next move, and after f takes e, his queen would be under attack, but this time the queen can move to e3, as the pawn controls the g5 square and black cannot pin the queen anymore by playing bishop g5. Geller, of course, with a tempo, opens the a file for his rook, and after a takes b, again we reach the critical position. The bishop is still under attack, and now white is threatening to capture it, and after f takes e, his queen will move to e3. What to do? Again, if the bishop retreats, black would lose the dynamic energy of his position. So Geller didn't feel like doing it. Instead, he even increases the energy. So he insists upon the bishop sacrifice. After opening the file, after opening the a file, now all black major pieces will invade white's position and come closer and closer to the white king via the a file. So first the rook invades, rook a2. Now white finally accepts the bishop sacrifice. F takes e, f takes e. But again, the f file opens with a tempo, so white cannot even think about his pawn storm anymore. He doesn't have time for it, because black always creates threats, and that's another attacking principle. The attacking side should try to create threats with every move, and that's exactly what Geller does. After the queen moves to e3, he again creates immediate threats. Queen a5, increasing the pressure on the a file, and the immediate threat is rook takes b2, king takes b2, queen a3 check, king b1, and rook a8 threatening checkmate on a1. In order to prevent this, white plays c4, vacating the c2 square for the king so that the king can escape. But the c4 move has a serious drawback. It weakens the b3 pawn. On c2, of course, the pawn was defending the pawn, and now the b3 is terribly weakened, and it's already attacked once by the great c5 knight, and it's defended only once. So, another attacking principle. The attacking side should detect the main weaknesses in the enemy position and attack these weaknesses. And the main weaknesses in white's position are the b3 pawn now and, of course, the king, because the king isn't sufficiently defended. Most white pieces are placed on the king side and they cannot take part in the defense of the king. And the only defender, the main defender of the king, is the bishop. So now black sacrifices the exchange, removing this key defender. Rook takes b2. Now the dark squares are catastrophically weakened. And white doesn't have the bishop anymore, the dark squared bishop anymore to defend these squares, while black still has the dark squared bishop, which is currently passive, but as you will see very soon, this bishop will play the most important role in the attack. So white must capture. And now the queen invades. Queen a3 check. So not only black catastrophically weakened the dark squares, but also his queen invades and attacks the b3 pawn for the second time. Now the b3 pawn will fall. It is doomed. In case king moves to c2, then queen a2 check, king c1, and of course the pawn falls, check. The king doesn't have any moves and white must give up the queen. Black is winning. That's why the king moved to b1 instead of c2. Now Geller doesn't take the pawn. He makes a much stronger move. He brings his rook into the attack, again creating immediate threats. Queen a8 check is threatened, and after king c2, rook a2 checkmate. That's why white brings the knight into the defense. Knight c1, taking under control the a2 square and defending the b3 pawn. Geller plays queen a1 check, and after king c2, white needs just one move. Rook d2 in order to vacate the d1 square for his king and escape the king. In case white succeeds in doing that, he would solve all his problems. That means black must play energetically as possible. And Geller sacrifices the second exchange in order to remove the last defender of the king, the knight. So rook a2 check. White must capture the rook and queen takes a2 check, king c1. So white is up a rook and the exchange. However, now it's time for white to pay the price for the mistakes. White will return all material because the b3 pawn falls. Knight takes b3 check and there is no move except queen takes b2. White must give up the queen and now black has only slight material advantage. But his positional advantage is tremendous because while the black king is absolutely safe, the white king is under terrible attack. And the bishop, the last thing black must do is to bring the bishop into the attack, after which, of course, white's position would collapse. White tries to resist, rook d2, but queen c3 check, rook c2, queen e3 check, king b2, queen a3 check, king b1, b3, Geller pushes the pawn forward, attacking the rook, rook b2, Geller plays as energetically as possible until the very end, queen b4, creating an immediate threat, bishop takes h4, and after rook takes h4, queen e1 checkmate is threatened. That's why, in order to defend his h4 pawn, white plays g5. Now, of course, if black captures on c4, that might give white some counter chances. After rook h3, white might try to survive, because the important b3 pawn would fall. Of course, Geller doesn't do it, he didn't capture the pawn. Instead, again, he plays dynamically. Bishop d8. He's going to reroute his bishop to d4, after which white simply wouldn't have defense. White plays rook c1, bishop b6, bishop h3, attacking the pawn. Geller isn't in a hurry, he defends the pawn. And after h5, bishop d4, white gives the last checks, g6 check, h takes, check, king e7, and it turns out that black is going to play queen a3 next move, threatening checkmate on b2, and if the rook moves from b2, the checkmate would follow from a1, and there is no defense against these terrible threats. So white resigned. And now I recommend watching a game in which Geller gives a masterclass in an energetic attack on the uncastled king. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.